The scorching Arizona sun hung like a fiery lantern in the cloudless sky as Colton Owens guided his chestnut mare along the parched trail leading to Willow Creek. Dust devils danced across the horizon, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. The year was 1878, and the promise of silver had drawn countless souls to this unforgiving corner of the territory. But Colton wasn't chasing silver, he was running from ghosts. His weathered Stetson cast a shadow over eyes that had seen too much in his 28 years. The war between the states had claimed his youth, and the decades since had hardened what remained of his heart. A gunslinger by necessity rather than choice, he'd built a reputation that kept most trouble at bay, though it brought its own burdens. As Willow Creek's modest buildings appeared in the distance, Colton adjusted the revolver at his hip, a habit more than a necessity. The small mining settlement had sprung up 3 years prior, when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains. Now it teetered on the edge of becoming a proper town, or fading into the countless ghost settlements that dotted the west. The main street was alive with the usual bustle of a mining town, prospectors hauling equipment, merchants hawking wares, and saloon girls enticing customers despite the early hour. Colton's attention, however, was drawn to a commotion near the general store. A crowd had gathered, their murmurs carrying on the hot breeze. Through the gaps between onlookers, he spotted a woman swaying unsteadily before the storefront. Her pale blue dress was coated with trail dust, and her honey-colored hair had mostly escaped whatever pins once held it in place. Even from a distance, Colton could see she was in distress. "Stand aside," came a gruff male voice. "This ain't your concern, miss." The woman's voice was weaker but carried a steel edge. "These people need water, Mr. Dalton. You can't—" She never finished her sentence. As Colton watched, her knees buckled and she collapsed into the dust. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved to help her. Without conscious thought, Colton dismounted and pushed through the spectators. He knelt beside the fallen woman, noting her flushed face and parched lips. Heat exhaustion, most likely. "Stand back," he commanded, and something in his tone made the crowd comply. With practiced ease, Colton slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing more than a feather, cradling her against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, a strand of hair catching on the stubble of his jaw. A heavy-set man with a florid face and expensive waistcoat stepped forward. "Now see here," Colton's gaze stopped the man mid-sentence. "Where's the doctor?" A young boy pointed down the street. "End of the road, mister. White house with the blue door." With a nod of thanks, Colton strode away, the unconscious woman secure in his arms. He never looked back at the muttering crowd, his focus entirely on the too pale face of the woman he carried. The doctor's house was mercifully close. Colton kicked at the door with the toe of his boot, and it swung open to reveal a silver-haired man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Good heavens!" the doctor exclaimed, immediately gesturing Colton inside. "Bring her in." "What happened?" "Collapsed in the street," Colton replied tersely. "Heat, I reckon." The doctor led him to a small examination room. "Place her here. I'm Dr. Fredericks." Colton gently laid the woman on the indicated bed. "Colton Owens." Dr. Fredericks moved efficiently, checking the woman's pulse and breathing before lifting her eyelids to examine her pupils. "She's severely dehydrated, been in the sun too long without proper water." He reached for a cloth, dipped it in a basin of water, and placed it on her forehead. "You know her?" Colton shook his head. "Never seen her before today." The doctor raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. "Well, Mr. Owens, you likely saved her life. Another hour in this heat without attention." He let the implication hang in the air. "I need to prepare some medicines. Can I trust you to stay with her a moment? Colton hesitated. Getting involved wasn't his way. He'd learned the hard way that attachments brought pain, but something about the woman's determined expression, even as she'd fallen, stayed with him. I'll stay. As Dr. Fredericks bustled out, Colton studied the woman more carefully. Despite the dust and heat, there was a refined quality to her features. Her hands, though reddened from sun exposure, bore the slender fingers of someone unaccustomed to hard labor. What was someone like her doing in a rough place like Willow Creek? A soft moan from the bed interrupted his thoughts. The woman's eyelids fluttered, then opened to reveal eyes the color of summer sage. Confusion clouded her gaze as she tried to focus on her surroundings. "Easy," Colton said, his voice gentler than usual. "You're at the doctor's. You collapsed." She blinked, struggling to sit up. The water wagons. Colton placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Don't try to move yet," she relented, sinking back against the pillow. "Who are you?" "Colton Owens. I brought you here." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The man with the chestnut mare I saw you ride in." She attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Penelope Osborne. Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Owens." Dr. Fredericks returned with a glass of water mixed with something powdery. "Ah, you're awake. Excellent. Drink this slowly, Miss Osborne." Colton helped her sit up enough to sip the medicine, acutely aware of her fragility beneath his hands. When she'd finished, Dr. Fredericks checked her pulse again. "You'll need rest, Miss Osborne, at least until tomorrow. That business with Dalton can wait." Her expression hardened. "It cannot wait, Doctor. Those families at the settlement will still be there tomorrow," the doctor interrupted firmly. "You're no good to them unconscious." Penelope subsided, though Colton could see the frustration in the set of her jaw. Dr. Fredericks turned to him. "Mr. Owens, I hate to impose, but might I trouble you to inform Mrs. Miller that Miss Osborne won't be returning to her boarding house tonight?" Before Colton could respond, Penelope spoke up. "That's unnecessary, Doctor. I'll be well enough to—" "You will not, Doctor," Frederick stated with the authority of his profession. "Either you stay here under observation, or I'll have Mr. Owens carry you straight to Mrs. Miller's and instruct her to lock you in your room." The absurdity of the threat brought a reluctant smile to Penelope's lips. "Very well." "You win, Doctor." Colton, seeing an opportunity to extract himself, nodded. "I'll let Mrs. Miller know." "The yellow house 2 doors down from the Mercantile," Dr. Fredericks supplied. "And perhaps you could bring back Miss Osborne's things for the night." Colton wanted to refuse. He'd done his good deed. Getting further involved wasn't wise, yet he found himself nodding again. "I'll see to it." As he turned to leave, Penelope called after him. "Mr. Owens, thank you, truly." Something in her earnest gaze tugged at a part of Colton he'd thought long buried. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. Mrs. Miller proved to be a plump, talkative widow who fussed endlessly upon hearing of her boarder's condition. "That poor dear. I told her she was working too hard in this heat, but would she listen? So determined, that one." She bustled about, packing a small overnight bag with Penelope's necessities. "You'll see she gets these, Mr. Owens, and tell her not to worry about a thing." Colton assured her he would, increasingly curious about the woman he'd rescued. "How long has Miss Osborne been in town?" "Just over a month now," Mrs. Miller replied, carefully folding a nightgown into the bag. "Came out from Boston on the stage, teaching the children at the settlement and fighting with that awful Dalton over water rights." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, Mr. Owens, we need more folks like her standing up to men like Dalton. He thinks because he owns the largest mine, he can own the whole valley." The pieces were beginning to fit together. "The settlement, that's the homesteader's place." "Over by Cottonwood Creek," Mrs. Miller nodded. Those poor families. Dalton diverted most of their water for his mining operation, and with this drought. She shook her head sadly. Miss Osborne's been trying to arrange for water deliveries, but Dalton controls the freight company too. Colton's jaw tightened. He'd seen this story play out across the West, powerful men squeezing out smaller operators and homesteaders by controlling essential resources. It rarely ended well for the little folk. Returning to the doctor's house with the bag, Colton found Penelope sleeping, her breathing now steady and color returning to her cheeks. Dr. Fredericks took the bag with thanks. "She'll be much improved by morning," the doctor assured him. "You've done more than enough, Mr. Owens. I'm sure you have business of your own to attend." Colton did have business delivering a package to a man in Tucson, but it wasn't urgent. "What's this business with Dalton and the water?" Dr. Fredericks sighed, removing his spectacles to polish them with a handkerchief. "Victor Dalton owns the Silver Crown mine and most of Willow Creek besides. When drought hit last spring, he diverted Cottonwood Creek to support his mining operation. The homesteaders downstream, mostly families who came west after the war, were left with barely enough to survive. And Miss Osborne is involved because she came to teach their children but found them in dire straits. She's been advocating for them ever since, trying to arrange for fair water distribution." The doctor's expression turned grave. "Dalton doesn't take kindly to challenges, Mr. Owens. I fear for her safety if she continues." Colton's hand unconsciously moved to rest on his revolver. "Has he threatened her?" "Not directly. He's too clever for that, but accidents have a way of happening to those who oppose him." Dr. Fredericks replaced his spectacles. "She needs someone watching her back, but she's too stubborn to admit it." The implication hung in the air between them. Colton should walk away. This wasn't his fight. He delivered packages across the territory for 2 years precisely to avoid entanglements like this. "I'll check on her tomorrow before I leave town," he said finally, tipping his hat to the doctor as he departed. The Silver Dollar Saloon provided whiskey, a hot meal, and information. Seated in a corner with his back to the wall, old habits died hard. Colton listened more than he spoke. The locals were happy to talk about Victor Dalton and his iron grip on Willow Creek. "Man's ruthless," confided a grizzled miner nursing a beer. "My brother-in-law had a small claim that showed promise. Next thing you know, Dalton's men are saying he's encroaching on Silver Crown property. Judge ruled against him, same judge whose house Dalton paid to have built." "What about the woman, the teacher?" Colton asked casually. The miner snorted. "Miss Osborne, she's got more courage than sense. Been a thorn in Dalton's side since she arrived. Organizing the homesteaders, writing letters to the territorial governor." He leaned closer. "Word is, she's the daughter of some big-shot Boston lawyer, came west after some scandal back east. Dalton tried charming her at first, thinking to bring her to his side. When that failed." He drew a finger across his throat meaningfully. Colton's grip tightened on his glass. "Has he moved against her?" "Not yet. But Dalton's patience ain't endless. Those water wagons she was trying to arrange, they'll never arrive." Sleep came uneasily that night in the small room above the saloon. Colton told himself it wasn't his concern, that he'd be riding out tomorrow as planned. Yet when morning came, his feet carried him back to Dr. Fredericks' house. He found Penelope fully dressed and arguing with the doctor. "I'm perfectly well now," she insisted, though her complexion was still paler than it should be. "Those families are counting on me." Dr. Fredericks looked up as Colton entered. "Perhaps you can talk some sense into her, Mr. Owens. She intends to ride out to the settlement today, alone, after nearly dying of heat exhaustion yesterday." Penelope turned, and Colton was struck by her transformation. With her honey blonde hair neatly pinned and wearing a clean, pressed dress of cornflower blue, she looked every inch the proper Boston lady. Only the determination blazing in her eyes betrayed the steel beneath her refined exterior. "Mr. Owens," she greeted him. "How fortunate. You can assure the doctor that I'm perfectly capable of a short ride." Colton studied her carefully. "You're looking better, Miss Osborne, but the doctor has a point. The trail to the settlement isn't an easy one." Her chin lifted defiantly. "I've made the journey a dozen times." "Not a day after collapsing," he countered. For a moment they locked gazes, neither willing to yield. Then Colton made a decision that would alter the course of his carefully unattached life. "I'll take you," he said abruptly. "My business in Tucson can wait a day." Both Penelope and the doctor stared at him in surprise. "That's very kind," Penelope said cautiously, "but I wouldn't want to delay your journey." "It's settled," Colton stated flatly. "I'll bring the wagon around in an hour. We'll be back before sundown, Doctor." Fredericks looked between them, then nodded slowly. "Very well. But Miss Osborne, you must promise to drink regularly and stay out of the direct sun as much as possible." She agreed readily, clearly willing to accept any conditions that allowed her to fulfill her mission. An hour later, Colton waited outside Mrs. Miller's boarding house with a rented wagon. His own mare was tethered behind, as he had no intention of leaving her in town. The wagon contained several barrels of water purchased at considerable expense from the livery stable, and supplies he'd acquired from the general store. Penelope emerged promptly, now wearing a practical riding skirt and carrying a leather satchel. She stopped short at the sight of the water barrels. "Mr. Owens, what is this? Seemed pointless to visit folks dying of thirst without bringing water," he replied with a shrug. Her eyes widened. "But the cost, I'm not broke, Miss Osborne." He offered his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. "Though I might be if you keep looking at me like I've grown a second head." A smile broke across her face, a genuine one this time that reached her eyes and transformed her features. "You are an unexpected man, Mr. Owens." The journey to the settlement took nearly 2 hours, following a rutted trail that wound through scrubby hills. Colton kept a careful eye on Penelope, ensuring she drank water regularly and used her parasol to shield herself from the sun. They spoke little at first, but as the miles passed, the silence grew comfortable. "Why are you helping me?" she asked eventually. "You don't know me or these people." Colton kept his eyes on the trail. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when good folks stand alone against men like Dalton." She studied his profile. "You've fought such battles before, not successfully." The admission cost him, bringing back memories of a small Kansas farm and promises he'd failed to keep. Penelope seemed to sense the weight behind his words and didn't press further. Instead, she spoke of the settlement 12 families who'd come west seeking a fresh start after the devastation of the war and the economic turmoil that followed. "They were doing well until Dalton diverted the creek," she explained. "They've dug wells, but they're running dry in this drought. Without water for crops and livestock." She didn't need to finish the sentence. "And you got involved because," Colton prompted. A shadow crossed her face. "I came west seeking purpose, Mr. Owens. These people have given me that." There was more to her story. Colton could hear it in the careful phrasing, but he respected her privacy. Everyone in the West had something they'd left behind. The settlement came into view around midday, a cluster of modest cabins and small fenced fields that in better times would have been green with crops. Now they were dusty and barren. A few thin cattle grazed on what little scrub remained. Children paused in their play to watch the approaching wagon, then ran to alert the adults. By the time Colton halted the team in what passed for the settlement's center, a crowd had gathered. The relief on their faces when they recognized Penelope was palpable. Miss Osborne. A weather-beaten man in his 40s stepped forward. "We heard there was trouble in town." "Nothing serious, Mr. Reynolds," she assured him, descending from the wagon with Colton's assistance. "May I introduce Mr. Colton Owens? He's brought water." The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through the gathering. Reynolds extended a calloused hand to Colton. "James Reynolds, we're mighty grateful, sir." The next hour was spent distributing water to the families. Colton worked alongside the settlers, helping to fill containers and water the most desperate livestock. He observed Penelope moving among the people, checking on children, consulting with the women about provisions, and listening to the men's concerns about their failing crops. Despite her refined background, she fit here genuinely cared for these people. While the women prepared a simple meal to share, Reynolds took Colton to see the dry creek bed. "Used to run year-round," the settler explained, pointing to the cracked earth where water had once flowed. Then Dalton built a dam upstream to create a reservoir for his mining operation. Claims he has water rights, but our deeds clearly show riparian rights. "You've challenged him legally?" Colton asked, though he already suspected the answer. Reynolds spat into the dust. "Judge Williams is in Dalton's pocket. Ruled the mining operation constitutes essential territorial development that supersedes our claims." His expression hardened. "We're not giving up our land, mister. Most of us fought too hard to get here. What about moving elsewhere?" "There's land further south with more reliable water." "This is our home now," Reynolds said simply. "Besides, we couldn't afford to start over, even if we wanted to. Everything we have is sunk into these homesteads." It was a familiar story across the West: small farmers and ranchers, squeezed out by larger interests with deeper pockets and better connections. Colton had seen it play out dozens of times, rarely in favor of the little man. Back at the settlement, they shared a meal of beans, cornbread, and precious fresh vegetables from the remaining gardens. Despite their hardships, the settlers maintained their dignity and hospitality. Children played, couples exchanged affectionate glances, and conversation flowed around subjects other than their troubles. Colton found himself seated beside Penelope, observing her easy interactions with the settlers. She caught his gaze and smiled questioningly. "You belong here," he said quietly. "They trust you." "They've allowed me into their lives," she corrected. "It's a privilege I don't take lightly." An older woman approached, carrying a small bundle. "Miss Osborne, I finished the dress for Emma's doll like you asked." She handed the package to Penelope, then noticed Colton. "Your husband's a good man, bringing us water." Before Colton could correct the misunderstanding, Penelope spoke smoothly. "Mr. Owens isn't my husband, Mrs. Collins. He's a friend who offered his assistance." Mrs. Collins looked between them with knowing eyes. "If you say so, dear." She patted Penelope's hand and moved away, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. Penelope recovered first, her cheeks slightly flushed. "You must forgive Mrs. Collins. She's determined to see everyone happily married." "No offense taken," Colton assured her, though the mistaken assumption had stirred unexpected thoughts. As the afternoon waned, Penelope visited each family to assess their needs, making notes in a small leather-bound book. Colton helped the men repair a broken wagon and shore up a sagging roof, earning their respect with his capable hands and few words. When it came time to depart, Reynolds pulled Colton aside while Penelope said her goodbyes to the children. "She's fighting a losing battle," the settler said bluntly. "Dalton won't stop until he owns everything between here and the territorial line. She's putting herself at risk for us." Colton watched Penelope kneeling to embrace a small girl. "She knows the risks." "Knowing and understanding are different things." Reynolds fixed him with a hard stare. She needs someone watching her back, someone who understands men like Dalton. I'm just passing through, Colton said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Reynolds nodded skeptically. Aren't we all? Until we find a reason to stay. The return journey began in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts as the settlement disappeared behind them. The afternoon heat had begun to wane, painting the landscape in softer hues of amber and rose. They're good people, Colton finally said. Penelope nodded. The best. They deserve better than what Dalton is doing to them. What's your plan? Legal channels have failed, she sighed, tucking a stray strand of honey-blonde hair behind her ear. I've written to the territorial governor and several newspapers in Tucson and Phoenix. If enough attention is drawn to the situation, perhaps Dalton can be pressured into a fair water-sharing agreement. Colton had his doubts. Men like Dalton didn't yield to public opinion. They bought it. But he kept his skepticism to himself, not wanting to discourage her. What brought you to Arizona Territory, Miss Osborne? It's a long way from Boston. She was quiet for so long that Colton thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was soft but steady. I was engaged to be married. My fiancé was from one of Boston's oldest families, as was I. It was considered an excellent match. Her fingers twisted in her lap. 3 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he had other arrangements with a woman across town. A home, 2 children. Colton whistled softly. Complicated. A wry smile touched her lips. Indeed. When I confronted him, he admitted everything but expected me to proceed with the marriage anyway. These arrangements are common in our circles, he said, as if that made it acceptable. You refused. I did, publicly, at a dinner hosted by his parents. Now there was a flash of satisfaction in her eyes. The scandal was considerable. Colton couldn't help but chuckle. I imagined so. My parents were mortified. They suggested I visit distant relatives until the gossip subsided. Her expression grew distant. But I'd had enough of Boston society and its hypocrisies. I'd always wanted to teach, and when I saw an advertisement for teachers in the Western Territories, she shrugged. I made my decision within the hour. Brave choice, Colton remarked, genuinely impressed, or foolish. My father called it both. She turned to study his profile. And what of you, Mr. Owens? What brings a man like you to escort schoolteachers and deliver water to struggling homesteaders? It was Colton's turn to consider his response carefully. Few people knew his full story, and he preferred it that way. Yet something about Penelope Osborne's direct gaze invited honesty. I grew up on a small farm in Kansas, he began, surprising himself with the admission. My father died in '62 at Antietam. I was 12, old enough to help my mother keep the farm going until my older brother returned from the war. Did he return? Yes. Changed like most who fought, but alive. We managed well enough for a few years. Then a cattle company decided our land would make a good grazing route to the railroad. His jaw tightened at the memory. They offered to buy us out. When we refused, accidents started happening. Fences cut, cattle stampeding through our crops. Penelope's eyes darkened with understanding. Like Dalton, just like Dalton, my brother confronted them. Colton's voice grew flat. They shot him down in the street, claimed self-defense. No witnesses willing to say otherwise. I'm so sorry, she said softly, her hand moving to rest lightly on his arm. My mother sold the farm for a fraction of its worth a month later, died within the year. He hadn't spoken of this in so long, the words felt foreign on his tongue. I drifted, did what I had to survive, learned how men like that operate. Is that why you helped me? Because of what happened to your family. Colton guided the team around a bend in the trail before answering. Maybe, or maybe I just couldn't leave a stubborn woman collapsed in the dust. He glanced at her with the ghost of a smile. The lightness of his tone dispelled some of the heaviness between them. Penelope returned his smile, and something shifted in the air, a recognition of shared understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. As they approached Willow Creek, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. The settlement looked almost picturesque in the golden light, its rough edges softened by distance and dusk. "Will you be staying in town, Mr. Owens?" Penelope asked as the first buildings came into view. Before he could respond, the sharp crack of a rifle split the air. Colton reacted instinctively, pulling Penelope down and shielding her with his body as a bullet splintered the wagon seat where she'd been sitting moments before. "Stay down," he ordered, reaching for his revolver while scanning the surrounding terrain. The shot had come from a cluster of rocks overlooking the trail, a perfect position for an ambush. 2 more shots followed in quick succession, one grazing the team of horses and causing them to bolt forward in panic. Colton fought to control the frightened animals while keeping Penelope protected beneath him. "Can you take the reins?" he shouted over the thundering hooves and rattling wagon. She nodded, face pale but determined. Colton transferred control of the team to her capable hands, then twisted to return fire toward their unseen attacker. His shot was meant to suppress, rather than hit. He had no clear target, but it bought them precious seconds to gain distance. Penelope handled the team admirably, guiding the panicked horses along the trail as Colton continued to provide covering fire. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the shooting had stopped, but Colton remained vigilant, his body tense with readiness. "Head for the sheriff's office," he directed, and Penelope complied without question. Sheriff Webb was a lanky man with a salt and pepper mustache and weary eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. He listened to their account of the ambush with a grave expression. "Can't say I'm surprised," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "You've made yourself a target, Miss Osborne, challenging Dalton the way you have." "Then you believe Dalton was behind the attack?" Penelope pressed. The sheriff spread his hands. "I didn't say that. Could have been road agents. Could have been someone with a grudge against Mr. Owens here, without witnesses or evidence." "Convenient," Colton remarked coldly. Webb's eyes narrowed. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning it's interesting how little effort you seem inclined to make, Sheriff." The lawman rose slowly, hand drifting toward his gun. "You questioning my integrity, stranger? Gentlemen, please." Penelope stepped between them. "Sheriff Webb, all we ask is that you investigate the matter. Someone tried to kill us on a public road in broad daylight. Surely that warrants some attention." Webb held Colton's gaze for a long moment before relenting. "I'll ride out at first light, check the scene." He turned to Penelope. "But I'd advise you to consider your position carefully, Miss Osborne. Arizona territory can be dangerous for those who don't understand how things work here." The threat was thinly veiled, confirming Colton's suspicions about where the sheriff's loyalties lay. They left the office with no illusions about receiving justice through official channels. "He won't find anything," Colton said as they walked toward Mrs. Miller's boarding house. Penelope's mouth was set in a grim line. "I know, but I needed to see for myself how deep Dalton's influence runs." She paused, studying Colton's face in the fading light. "You saved my life again, Mr. Owens." "Colton," he corrected automatically. "After being shot at together, I think we can dispense with formalities." A small smile touched her lips. "Colton, then, and you must call me Penelope." They had reached the boarding house porch. Mrs. Miller peered anxiously through the window, clearly having heard about the shooting. "Will you be leaving tomorrow?" Penelope asked, her tone carefully neutral. Colton knew he should. His business in Tucson awaited, and entangling himself further in Willow Creek's problems was foolish. Yet the memory of the rifle shots aimed squarely at Penelope made his decision for him. "Not just yet," he answered. "I think I'll stay in town a while longer." Relief flashed across her face, quickly masked by composure. "Then perhaps you join me for dinner tomorrow, Mrs. Miller sets a fine table." "I'd like that," he replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. As Colton turned to leave, he caught sight of a figure watching from the shadows across the street, one of Dalton's men, he was certain. The message was clear. They were being observed. Let them watch, Colton thought grimly. If Dalton wanted a fight, he'd find Colton Owens a more dangerous opponent than a Boston schoolteacher. The next morning found Colton at the livery stable, tending to his mare and the team that had pulled them to safety the previous day. The sorrel gelding had a shallow graze along his flank, where the bullet had struck, a reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. "You got lucky," came a voice from behind him. Colton turned to find a lean, dark-haired man leaning against the stable door. He recognized him as one of the men who'd been watching the confrontation with Dalton the day he'd arrived. "Luck had little to do with it," Colton replied evenly, his hand casually moving closer to his revolver. The man noticed the movement and raised his hand slightly. "Easy. I'm not here to cause trouble. Name's Michael Hayes. I work for myself, not Dalton, despite what some might think." "What do you want, Hayes?" "To give you some advice. You and the schoolteacher are stirring up a hornet's nest. Dalton doesn't like interference, especially not with his water rights." Colton continued brushing his mare, apparently unconcerned. "Noted." Hayes pushed away from the doorframe. "There's more. Dalton's got something planned for the settlement. I don't know what exactly, but his men have been stockpiling explosives. Could be for mining, or it could be for removing an obstacle permanently," Colton finished, now giving Hayes his full attention. "Why tell me this?" A shadow crossed Hayes's weathered features. "I've got my reasons. Just thought you should know what you're up against." He turned to leave, then paused. "And watch out for Jenkins, the deputy. He reports everything directly to Dalton." Before Colton could question him further, Hayes was gone, leaving only the scent of tobacco and leather in his wake. Colton mulled over the warning as he finished caring for the horses. If Hayes was telling the truth, the situation was more dire than they'd realized. Dalton might be planning to destroy the homesteader's dam or wells, or worse, create an accident that would eliminate the settlement entirely. He found Penelope at the general store, negotiating with the proprietor over supplies for the settlement. Despite yesterday's attack, she carried herself with unwavering determination, her honey blonde hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, her posture straight as a cavalry officer's. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine expression that brightened her sage-green eyes. "Good morning, Colton. You're just in time to help me convince Mr. Parker that his flower prices are highway robbery." Parker, a balding man with shrewd eyes, threw up his hands in mock surrender. "I've already lowered them as far as I can, Miss Osborne. A man has to make a living." "A fair living, Mr. Parker, not an extortionate one," she countered good-naturedly. Colton watched their exchange with amusement, noting how even in negotiation, Penelope maintained a respectful rapport with the merchant. When they'd finally reached an agreement that satisfied both parties, Colton helped load the purchases into a smaller wagon Penelope had arranged to borrow. "You're planning to return to the settlement?" he asked. Though he already knew the answer, she nodded, securing a crate of canned goods. "They need these supplies, especially now that their crops are failing. I won't let Dalton intimidate me into abandoning them." "I had a visitor this morning," Colton said quietly, explaining Hayes's warning as they worked. Penelope's expression grew grave. "Do you believe him? I think it would be foolish not to consider the possibility." Colton finished tying down the last of the supplies. If Dalton is planning something against the settlement, we need to be prepared. Her eyes met his, searching. Yes, we. The decision had crystallized overnight. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Something unspoken passed between them, a connection deeper than their brief acquaintance should allow. For a moment, they stood close enough that Colton could see the faint freckles dusting her nose, smell the lavender soap she used. The moment was broken by the appearance of Victor Dalton himself, flanked by two men whose hands hovered near their weapons. Dalton was a tall, imposing figure with a neatly trimmed beard and the attire of a successful businessman. Only his cold eyes betrayed the ruthlessness beneath the civilized exterior. "Miss Osborne," he greeted her with exaggerated courtesy. "I heard about your unfortunate experience yesterday. Terrible business." Penelope's spine stiffened, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Dalton, how kind of you to concern yourself with my welfare." Dalton's gaze shifted to Colton, assessing. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Colton Owens," he replied without offering his hand. "Mr. Owens." Dalton nodded, a tight smile playing at his lips. "New to our little community, I understand. Passing through, perhaps?" "That depends." "On what, may I ask?" "On how hospitable the town proves to be." The implied challenge hung in the air between them. Dalton's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Willow Creek welcomes those who understand its ways, Mr. Owens." He turned back to Penelope. "Miss Osborne, I came to extend an invitation. I'm hosting a gathering at my home this evening, a small affair to discuss the town's development. As someone interested in the community's welfare, your presence would be valuable." Penelope hesitated, clearly surprised by the overture. "I appreciate the invitation, Mr. Dalton, but Mr. Owens is welcome as well, of course," Dalton added smoothly. 8 o'clock. Nothing formal. "I believe we may find we have more common ground than recent misunderstandings might suggest." Before either could respond, Dalton tipped his hat and departed, his men following close behind. "What game is he playing?" Penelope murmured, watching Dalton's retreating figure. Colton's expression was grim. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." They debated the wisdom of accepting Dalton's invitation as they delivered supplies to the settlement. Reynolds and the other homesteaders were divided on the matter. "Could be a trap," Reynolds warned, helping unload the wagon. "Or an opportunity to negotiate," countered Mrs. Reynolds, a practical woman with steel gray hair and keen eyes. "Sometimes the only way past an enemy is through them." In the end, they decided to attend, viewing it as a chance to assess Dalton's intentions and possibly find leverage to protect the settlement. Before returning to town, Colton helped the settlers implement basic security measures, early warning systems of tin cans on strings, designated meeting points in case of attack, and evacuation plans for the women and children. As dusk approached, they made their way back to Willow Creek. Colton escorted Penelope to Mrs. Miller's, agreeing to return in 2 hours to accompany her to Dalton's home. "Be careful," he cautioned as they parted. "Don't go anywhere alone, even within town." Her expression softened at his concern. "I'll be careful. Thank you, Colton." Alone in his room above the saloon, Colton cleaned his revolver and considered his options. Getting involved in Willow Creek's troubles had never been his intention. For years, he'd avoided putting down roots or forming attachments, carrying his past like armor against further loss. Yet in just 2 days, Penelope Osborne had somehow slipped past those defenses. Her courage, her dedication to people who weren't even her own, her refusal to be intimidated, they stirred something in Colton he'd thought long dead. He donned his cleanest shirt for the evening, a concession to propriety rather than any desire to impress Dalton. His revolver remained at his hip, however, some conventions he wasn't willing to observe. When he arrived at Mrs. Miller's to collect Penelope, the sight of her momentarily stole his breath. She wore a gown of deep blue that complemented her eyes, her honey blonde hair arranged in an elegant style that softened her features. It was a reminder of her Boston upbringing, so different from the practical attire she usually wore. "You look beautiful," he said simply. A blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you. It seems odd to dress for a social occasion when the circumstances are so tense." "Sometimes appearances matter," Colton replied, offering his arm. Ready to enter the lion's den, her smile was determined. "As I'll ever be." Dalton's mansion stood on a hill overlooking Willow Creek, a testament to the wealth his mining operations had generated. Constructed of imported stone and wood, it would not have looked out of place in a prosperous eastern city. Lanterns illuminated the grounds, and the sounds of music and conversation drifted from the open windows. A servant admitted them, directing them to a spacious parlor where about 20 of the town's more prominent citizens had gathered. Conversations faltered briefly as they entered, curious gazes assessing the unlikely pair, the refined Boston schoolteacher and the dangerous-looking stranger. Dalton appeared almost immediately, playing the gracious host. "Miss Osborne, Mr. Owens, I'm delighted you could join us." He guided them further into the room, introducing them to merchants, the bank manager, and other pillars of the community. Colton noted the careful orchestration. Dalton was presenting himself as a civilized benefactor, not the ruthless businessman who diverted water from desperate families. It was a calculated performance for the benefit of witnesses. As the evening progressed, Colton maintained a watchful presence at Penelope's side, observing the dynamics among Willow Creek's elite. Many deferred to Dalton with almost obsequious respect, while others seemed more reserved in their interactions. Judge Williams, the man who had ruled against the homesteaders, was particularly interesting. Despite his outward conviviality, Colton detected tension in his manner when Dalton approached. Not fear, exactly, but wariness. Dinner was an elaborate affair, with Penelope seated at Dalton's right hand, and Colton placed across the table, separated from her by design. The conversation flowed around local matters, the progress of the mining operation, plans for a proper church building, the possibility of the railroad extending a spur to Willow Creek. It wasn't until the dessert course that Dalton addressed the subject that had brought them there. "Miss Osborne," he began, his tone conversational, "I understand your concern for the homesteaders at Cottonwood Creek. Admirable, truly. But I fear you may not fully appreciate the economic realities we face in developing this territory." Penelope set down her spoon, meeting Dalton's gaze directly. "I understand that development requires resources, Mr. Dalton. I simply question whether that development should come at the expense of families who have legal claim to their land and water." Murmurs rippled around the table, some uncomfortable, others approving. Dalton remained unruffled. Legal claims are complex matters in a growing territory, as Judge Williams can attest. He nodded toward the judge, who shifted slightly in his seat. "What benefits the greatest number must sometimes take precedence over individual interests." "And who determines what benefits the greatest number?" Penelope asked, her voice mild but pointed. Dalton smiled thinly. "Progress determines that, Miss Osborne. The Silver Crown mine employs over 100 men, supports their families, and attracts business to Willow Creek. The settlement, while charming in its simplicity, contributes little to the territory's growth." "Except food," Colton interjected, drawing all eyes to him. Those farms you're so eager to dry out were producing crops that fed this town before your mine expanded. A flash of annoyance crossed Dalton's face before his composed mask returned. Mr. Owens makes a fair point. Agricultural production is indeed valuable. He leaned forward, addressing the table at large, which is why I've been developing a proposal that might resolve our current impasse. Penelope exchanged a quick glance with Colton, her surprise matching his own. I propose a partnership, Dalton continued. The Silver Crown Mining Company would construct a more efficient irrigation system serving both our operations and the settlement. In exchange, the homesteaders would deed a 15-foot right-of-way along the creek for our water transport needs. The proposal sounded reasonable on its surface, too reasonable for a man like Dalton. Why the sudden change of heart? Colton asked bluntly. Dalton spread his hands in a gesture of openness. Not a change of heart, Mr. Owens, a recognition of mutual interests. The unfortunate tensions of recent months benefit no one. He turned to Penelope. I hope you'll consider presenting this offer to your friends at the settlement. I believe it represents a path forward that serves everyone's needs. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful maneuvering. When they finally took their leave, Colton and Penelope maintained their composure until they were well away from Dalton's mansion. He's planning something, Colton said immediately. That offer is too convenient. Penelope nodded, her expression troubled. I agree. The question is, what's his true objective? That right-of-way he mentioned, it must be significant somehow. They discussed possibilities as they walked back toward town, their steps slowing as they approached Mrs. Miller's boarding house. Neither seemed eager to end the evening, despite the tensions of Dalton's dinner party. I'll speak with Hayes tomorrow, Colton decided. If anyone knows what Dalton really wants with that right-of-way, it might be him. Penelope agreed, then hesitated on the boarding house porch, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp beyond the window. Thank you for coming with me tonight. I wouldn't have wanted to face that alone. Something in her expression, vulnerability beneath the courage, moved Colton deeply. Without thinking, he reached out to brush a stray curl from her cheek. You wouldn't have to. Not while I'm here. Their eyes held, the moment stretching between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Colton found himself leaning closer, drawn by a force as inevitable as gravity. Penelope's lips parted slightly, her gaze dropping to his mouth. The porch door swung open, startling them apart. Mrs. Miller stood in the doorway, her expression knowing. There you are. I was beginning to worry. Come in, dear, before the night air gives you a chill. She glanced between them, poorly concealing her approval. Good night, Mr. Owens. Do call again soon. The interruption broke the spell, though the tension lingered. Penelope bid Colton a slightly breathless good night, her cheeks flushed. Tomorrow, he promised. We'll figure out what Dalton's really after. Sleep eluded him that night, his thoughts alternating between Dalton's suspicious offer and the memory of Penelope's face in the lamplight. By dawn, he was already at the livery, saddling his mare for a ride to clear his head. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Colton rode toward the hills overlooking town, seeking higher ground from which to consider their situation. From this vantage, he could see the layout of the valley. Willow Creek nestled against the eastern slopes, Dalton's mine operations to the north, and the distant smudge of the settlement to the west. The geography told a story that had been nagging at his subconscious. The right-of-way Dalton wanted would give him control of the narrow passage between two ridge lines, a natural bottleneck controlling access to the western portion of the valley. Son of a bitch, Colton muttered, suddenly understanding Dalton's strategy. He wheeled his mare around, intending to return to town immediately, when he spotted riders approaching the settlement from the north, at least a dozen men, moving with purpose. Even from a distance, Colton recognized the distinctive hat of Dalton's foreman among them. Whatever Dalton was planning, it was already in motion. Colton rode hard, cutting across country toward the settlement. He had to warn them, had to reach Penelope. The mare responded to his urgency, stretching into a full gallop across the uneven terrain. He was still a mile from the settlement when he heard the first explosion. A plume of dust rose from near the creek, followed by shouts and the distant crack of gunfire. Pushing his mare even harder, Colton crested a small rise to see chaos unfolding at the settlement. Dalton's men had split into two groups, one engaging the settlers in gunfire to distract them, while the other set explosives along what appeared to be the main well and water storage. Reynolds and the other men were returning fire from defensive positions, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Women and children huddled in the central cabin, while others tried to extinguish a fire that had broken out in one of the outbuildings. Colton drew his revolver, prepared to enter the fray, when movement near the creek caught his eye. Penelope, mounted on a borrowed horse, was racing toward the settlement from the direction of town. How had she known? The question flashed through Colton's mind even as he adjusted his course to intercept her. She would ride straight into the gunfight if he didn't stop her. Penelope. He shouted as their paths converged. "Stop! Dalton's men are attacking." She reined in her horse, eyes wide with fear and determination. "I know. Hayes came to Mrs. Miller's at dawn, said Dalton ordered the settlement destroyed after we left last night. I tried to find you. You should have stayed in town," Colton cut in, though he knew the futility of such an admonition. Of course she'd come. These people were under her protection. Another explosion rocked the settlement, this one larger than the first. The main well collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris. "They're destroying the water supply," Penelope realized, horror in her voice. "Without it, the settlement can't survive." Colton's mind raced. Direct confrontation would likely get them killed. Dalton's men were professional gun hands, and he was just one man. They needed leverage, something to force Dalton to withdraw. "The dam," he said suddenly. "Dalton's dam. It's the key to everything." Understanding dawned in Penelope's eyes. If we threatened the dam, he'd have to pull his men back to protect it. It was a desperate plan, but the only one available. "I need you to create a distraction," Colton told her. "Ride to that rise over there where Dalton's men can see you. Make them think you're bringing help from town. Don't get too close, just make sure they spot you." Penelope nodded, fear evident in her eyes but determination winning out. "And you, I'm going to borrow some of their explosives." He held her gaze for a moment. "Be careful, please." "You too," she replied softly. They separated, Penelope riding toward the ridge while Colton circled wide to approach from the northern flank, where several of Dalton's men were setting charges around the settlement's irrigation ditches. Using the cover of brush and the distraction of the ongoing gunfire, Colton dismounted and crept closer. From his new position, he could see Penelope on the ridge, waving her arms and shouting. The ruse worked. Several of Dalton's men turned their attention toward her, wary of reinforcements from town. In the confusion, Colton made his move. He rushed the nearest man, catching him unaware and knocking him unconscious with the butt of his revolver. The man's satchel yielded what he sought: 3 sticks of dynamite and blasting caps. Gunshots rang out as one of Dalton's men spotted him. Colton returned fire, diving behind an overturned wagon for cover. The wood splintered around him as bullets struck his shelter. "Penelope, go!" he shouted, hoping she'd retreat to safety. Instead, she rode directly toward him, using her horse to create a dust cloud that temporarily obscured Dalton's men's line of sight. In the moment of confusion, she reached Colton's position. "Take my hand," she called, extending her arm toward him. Without hesitation, Colton grasped her wrist and swung up behind her on the horse. They galloped away as bullets kicked up dust at their heels. "The dam," Colton directed, securing the explosives inside his jacket. "We need to reach it before they realize what we're doing." Penelope urged the horse northward, toward Dalton's water diversion. They rode hard, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. Within 20 minutes, they reached the dam, an impressive structure of timber and stone that completely blocked the natural flow of Cottonwood Creek, creating a large reservoir for the mining operation. "You don't need to destroy it," Colton explained, dismounting and examining the control gates. "Just threaten it convincingly enough that Dalton has to respond." He worked quickly, placing the dynamite at strategic points along the dam's main outlet gates, where an explosion would release the water downstream without completely destroying the structure. As he worked, Penelope kept watch, her expression tense. "Someone's coming," she warned, pointing to a dust cloud approaching from the direction of town. Colton finished setting the charges, then helped Penelope to a position of cover behind some boulders overlooking the dam. From this vantage, they could control the situation while remaining protected from gunfire. Victor Dalton himself led the approaching riders, accompanied by his foreman and 4 armed men. They drew up at the base of the dam, clearly alerted to the threat. "That's far enough," Colton called out, his voice carrying in the morning air. Dalton peered up at their position, his face contorted with anger. "Owens, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "Negotiating," Colton replied calmly. "Call your men off the settlement, Dalton. Now. Or your dam doesn't survive the day." "You're bluffing," Dalton snarled, though uncertainty tinged his voice. In answer, Colton lit a match and held it visibly above one of the fuses. "Care to test that theory? One word from me and Miss Osborne lights these charges. You might rebuild eventually, but your mining operation will be dried up for months." Dalton's face paled. "You'd be murderers. There are men working downstream, as opposed to your men who are merely destroying homes and shooting at families." Penelope interjected, her voice steady despite her fear. "Order them to withdraw, Mr. Dalton, then we can discuss terms." A tense silence followed as Dalton weighed his options. Finally, he turned to his foreman. "Jenkins, ride back and tell the men to pull out." The foreman hesitated. "Boss, we almost got them. Do it," Dalton snapped. Now, as Jenkins rode off, Dalton turned his attention back to Colton and Penelope. "You've made a dangerous enemy today. This won't end here." "Actually, it will," Penelope responded, stepping slightly forward. "Because you're going to sign a legal water-sharing agreement today, and you're going to compensate the settlement for damages." Dalton laughed harshly. "Or what? You'll destroy the dam. Then no one has water." "Or," Colton interrupted, "we take what we know to the territorial governor." "About your methods, about Judge Williams's conflicts of interest, about the attack on the settlement. Miss Osborne has friends in Boston whose newspapers would find it an interesting story." The threat of exposure seemed to affect Dalton more than the physical danger to his dam. His expression hardened, but calculation replaced the raw anger in his eyes. "What exactly are you proposing?" Over the next hour, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, they negotiated. Penelope displayed a shrewd legal mind that surprised even Colton, drafting terms that would protect the settlement, while allowing Dalton's mining operation to continue with reduced water usage. By midday, they had an agreement. Dalton would sign a legally binding water-sharing contract, pay damages to the settlement, and withdraw all claims to the right-of-way. In exchange, Penelope would not publicize the events of the morning or Dalton's previous actions against the homesteaders. "I'll need Judge Williams to witness this," Dalton said as they prepared to return to town. "And Marshal Fletcher from Tucson," Colton added. "Someone outside your sphere of influence." Dalton's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. They rode back to Willow Creek in uneasy procession. The dynamite safely removed from the dam, but the threat of its use still hanging in the air. At the settlement, they found Reynolds and the others treating their wounded mercifully. No one had been killed, though 2 men had suffered gunshot wounds and several buildings had been damaged. The settlers' relief at the negotiated agreement was palpable, though many regarded Dalton with undisguised hostility as he signed the documents in the community cabin. By late afternoon, with Marshal Fletcher summoned from Tucson and the papers officially witnessed, the crisis was resolved at least on paper. As Dalton and his men departed, Reynolds approached Colton and Penelope. "You two saved this settlement today," he said simply. "We won't forget it." The following days were a blur of activity. Repairs began on the settlement's buildings and water system, with supplies and assistance flowing from unexpected sources in town. It seemed Dalton's iron grip on Willow Creek had been weakened by the confrontation. Many citizens who had previously feared opposing him now felt emboldened to show support for the homesteaders. Penelope threw herself into the recovery efforts, coordinating aid and continuing her teaching duties among the children. Colton worked alongside the men, rebuilding what had been destroyed, his quiet competence earning their respect and gratitude. They found little time alone together amid the constant activity, though the connection between them continued to deepen. Shared glances across busy spaces, fingers brushing when passing tools, the occasional moment of quiet conversation as dusk fell, each interaction strengthened the bond neither was quite ready to name. A week after the confrontation at the dam, Colton found Penelope sitting alone on the porch of the settlement schoolhouse, watching the sunset paint the western sky in hues of gold and crimson. He settled beside her on the rough-hewn bench, the wood still warm from the day's heat. "The new well is finished," he informed her. "Better than the old one, according to Reynolds." She nodded, a smile touching her lips. "And the irrigation ditches, complete by tomorrow. The crops that survived should make it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the settlement preparing for evening providing a gentle backdrop. "What will you do now?" Penelope finally asked, the question that had hovered between them for days. Colton considered his answer carefully. For so long, his life had been defined by movement, by avoiding attachment. The package he was supposed to deliver to Tucson remained in his saddlebag, his client undoubtedly irritated by the delay. Yet the thought of riding away from Willow Creek from Penelope felt impossible now. "I was thinking of staying," he said simply. "The settlement could use an extra hand, and there's talk of needing a new sheriff in town now that Webb's allegiance to Dalton has been exposed." Hope flared in Penelope's eyes. "You'd be an excellent sheriff. And you?" he asked, his heart beating faster. "Will you return to Boston now that your battle is won?" She shook her head slowly. "This is where I belong now, these people, this place." Her gaze met his, steady and certain. "The life I want to build is here." The last rays of sunlight caught in her honey blonde hair, turning it to spun gold. Colton reached out, his calloused fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek. "Penelope," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I've spent years running from connections, from putting down roots. But these past days, fighting alongside you, seeing your courage and your heart, I'm not running anymore." Her hand came up to cover his, her touch warm and sure. "I'm glad, because I've found something here I never expected." She leaned closer, her voice softening. "Someone I never expected." This time, there was no interruption as Colton closed the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, tender at first, then deepening with the promise of all that might be. When they finally parted, staying close enough that their foreheads touched, Colton knew with absolute certainty that his life had changed irrevocably that day in Willow Creek, when he'd seen her collapsing in the dust. He'd lifted her like a feather then, not knowing he was also lifting the weight of his solitary existence, and he had never looked back. In the months that followed, Willow Creek underwent a transformation. With Dalton's influence diminished, the town found a more balanced path forward. The mine continued to operate, but under the terms of the water-sharing agreement, ensuring the settlement's farms could flourish as well. Colton was indeed appointed sheriff, his reputation for fairness and steady nerve making him a natural choice once Webb resigned in disgrace. He approached the role with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, establishing himself as a man who stood for justice rather than the highest bidder's interests. Penelope expanded her teaching to include evening classes for adults in the settlement, helping many learn to read and write for the first time. She maintained correspondence with influential contacts in Boston, gradually attracting support for the territory's educational needs. Their courtship progressed with the steady certainty of two people who had already faced life's trials together. They were married that winter in the settlement's newly completed church, with Reynolds standing as Colton's best man and Mrs. Miller weeping happily in the front pew. As a wedding gift, the grateful settlers built them a home on a plot of land between the town and the settlement, a physical manifestation of the bridge they had created between the two communities. Spring found them settled into their new life together. Colton continued his duties as sheriff while helping Penelope establish a small horse breeding operation on their land. She proved to have a natural touch with the animals, particularly the spirited Mustang mare Colton had captured and gentled as a wedding present for her. On a warm evening in May 1879, nearly a year after their first meeting, they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset that painted the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "I received a letter from my parents today," Penelope mentioned, her head resting comfortably against Colton's shoulder. "They're considering visiting in the autumn." Colton chuckled. "Your father still wants to make sure the wild gunslinger is treating his daughter properly." She smiled, taking his hand in hers. "I think he's curious about the man who accomplished what no Boston suitor could, winning my stubborn heart." "Not so difficult," Colton murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Just required facing down armed men and threatening to blow up a dam." Penelope laughed, the sound carrying on the evening breeze. "Such a romantic." Their easy banter was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They turned to see Michael Hayes riding toward their home, dust coating his clothes from a long journey. Colton stood, instantly alert. Hayes had left town shortly after the confrontation with Dalton, heading south to pursue silver prospects in Sonora. "Sheriff," Hayes greeted him, dismounting stiffly. "Mrs. Owens, sorry to disturb your evening. What brings you back to Willow Creek, Hayes?" Colton asked, noting the man's tense posture. Hayes glanced around before answering. "Trouble. Dalton's not as finished as we thought. He's been in Tucson meeting with investors and hiring guns." He handed Colton a folded newspaper. "This might explain it." The Tucson Herald's headline announced, "Silver Strike at Willow Creek. New Vein Discovered on Disputed Lands." The article detailed how geological surveys had identified a rich silver vein running directly beneath the settlement's land. "This changes everything," Penelope whispered, reading over Colton's shoulder. Colton's expression hardened. Dalton will try to invalidate the water agreement, claim the mineral rights beneath the settlement. Hayes nodded grimly. He's already filed papers with the Territorial Land Office. And he's hired a dozen gunmen from El Paso. They spent the night strategizing, sending riders to alert the settlement and preparing for Dalton's return. By dawn, Colton had deputized several reliable men, including Hayes and Reynolds. "We won't be driven out," Reynolds declared, speaking for all the settlers. "This is our home, and now we know why Dalton wanted it so badly." The confrontation they expected came 3 days later, when Dalton returned to Willow Creek with his investors and hired guns. He seemed genuinely surprised to find Colton and a line of armed deputies waiting at the town limits. "This is absurd, Sheriff," Dalton blustered. "I have every right to return to my property." "You do," Colton agreed evenly. "But your gunmen don't have the right to threaten this town or the settlement. They can turn around now, or they can spend time in my jail." The standoff might have turned violent if not for the timely arrival of a representative from the territorial governor's office, summoned by Penelope's urgent telegram. The official carried documents confirming the homesteaders' rights to both surface and mineral resources on their legally claimed lands. Rights Penelope had specifically included in the agreement Dalton had signed the previous summer. Faced with legal defeat and armed opposition, Dalton had no choice but to withdraw. His investors, seeing the situation was more complicated than he had represented, quickly distanced themselves from his schemes. In the aftermath, a new arrangement was negotiated, one that allowed for managed mining of the silver vein through a cooperative venture that would benefit both the settlement and Willow Creek. Dalton, his power irreparably diminished, eventually sold his interests and left the territory. The discovery of silver beneath their lands transformed the settlement's fortunes. No longer struggling to survive, the homesteaders were able to build proper homes, expand their farms, and establish a thriving community that worked in harmony with the town. Through it all, Colton and Penelope remained the heart of Willow Creek, their partnership a living example of what could be accomplished when courage and compassion joined forces. 5 years after that fateful day when the cowboy saw her collapsing in the dust, their family had grown to include twin boys with their mother's honey-blonde hair and their father's steady gaze, and a daughter whose arrival had coincided with the completion of Willow Creek's first proper schoolhouse, named Osborne Hall in honor of the teacher who had fought for the community's future. On the anniversary of their meeting, they made a tradition of riding together to the spot where Colton had first lifted Penelope from the dust. This year, with their children safely in Mrs. Miller's care, they sat beside Cottonwood Creek, now flowing freely thanks to improved water management, and reflected on the journey that had brought them together. "You ever regret it?" Penelope asked, her hand clasped warmly in Colton's. "Staying in Willow Creek when you could have continued roaming free," Colton's answer came without hesitation. "Not for a single moment." He gazed at the woman who had transformed his life, her sage green eyes still capable of taking his breath away. "I thought I was free before, but I was just running. Real freedom came when I stopped running, when I found something worth staying for." Penelope leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly in the curve of his shoulder. "I came west seeking purpose, never imagining I'd find so much more." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in the same golden hues that had welcomed Colton to Willow Creek that day in 1878, he reflected on how a single moment, the sight of a courageous woman collapsing in the dust, had changed the course of his life. He had lifted her like a feather, never looking back, and in doing so had found the home and the love he'd never dared to seek. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone: a family, a community, a legacy that would endure long after their own story became part of Willow Creek's history. And in the end, it was the simplest truth that mattered most. Sometimes the bravest act is not riding away, but staying to fight for what you love. In each other, Colton and Penelope had found something worth every struggle, every risk, every moment of courage it had taken to claim their shared happiness. It was a lesson they would pass to their children, and their children's children: that love, once found, was worth defending with everything you had, just as they had done and would continue to do for all the days of their lives.